Hello and welcome to Spiritual Awakenings International presents Bonjour et bienvenue, herzliche willkommen, hola et buenos dias, buongiorno, bon dia, and hello. I just said hello to all of you in 7 different languages to reflect the fact that Spiritual Awakenings International is an international organization. Thank you, all of you, for your love and support. We are blossoming like crazy since our launch 6 months ago. We presently have subscribers in 41 different countries around the world, on every continent except Antarctica. We're still waiting for those penguins to sign up. We're the penguin researchers. But thank you, all of you, for your love and support. So I am now going to introduce Robert Baer, who is the Vice President and co-founder of Spiritual Awakenings International. And he is going to say some opening remarks. So Robert, would you take it away, please?
Thank you very much, Dr. Kaysan. I am Robert Baer. I am the Vice President of Spiritual Awakenings International, and thank you all for coming today. We have a great presentation, and I'm coming to you from South Beach, Oregon. Dr. Kaysan's from Toronto, Canada, and our secretary, Linda Truex, is from Texas. And this is some of the format of the meeting. First of all, we have some esteemed guests here today. Francis Liu has registered, Dr. Francis Liu. He's on our Circle of Honor. And we have Dr. Kaysan's on our Circle of Honor, and so is Dr. Emma Bragdon, who's going to speak today. But our format of our meeting, everybody's going to be muted except the speaker. And if you have any questions, go into the chat room. The question and answer period will be at the end of the presentation, and Linda Truex, our secretary, will moderate the question and answer period. And I want to thank, all of us want to thank Integrative Mental Health for You for co-sponsoring this event. A wonderful organization. Thank you so much. And I'm going to give it back to Dr. Yvonne Kaysan, our president of Spiritual Awakenings International, to introduce our speaker. Yvonne?
Thank you, Robert. As Robert mentioned, and as I said earlier, I am Dr. Yvonne Kaysan, the president of Spiritual Awakenings International. And in addition to introducing Dr. Emma Bragdon today, I'd like to do a brief tribute to Dr. Bragdon. Spiritual Awakenings International has a Circle of Honor, as Robert mentioned. And what our Circle of Honor is, it's like a Hall of Fame. And this is where we acknowledge and honor groundbreakers and pioneers in the field of STEs in the last 100 years. So today it is my honor and privilege to do a tribute to Dr. Emma Bragdon, today's speaker, who is being inducted into the Spiritual Awakenings International Circle of Honor for her groundbreaking work relating to spiritual emergencies. We do plan to have an in-person induction ceremony to honor all of our Circle of Honor honorees at our first face-to-face conference. But because of COVID, we don't know when that's going to be. So today, I'd like to take this opportunity to honor Dr. Emma Bragdon on her induction into the Circle of Honor. So let me tell you a bit about Dr. Emma Bragdon. In 1987, Emma Bragdon earned her PhD in transpersonal psychology at ITP, the Institute of Transpersonal Psychology in California. She became a licensed psychotherapist shortly afterwards, and she specialized in private practice around the issues of psychospiritual crises, which is also known as spiritual emergencies, since 1988. Emma has been a pioneer in body, mind, spirit wellness for 50 years. She has written 7 books and co-produced 2 documentary films related to health and healing, paying special attention to those in spiritual crisis or spiritual emergency. From 1985 to 1992, for 7 important years, she volunteered at the Spiritual Emergence Network, where she was editing their journal and their newsletter. She was the coordinator of 2 invited conferences held at the Esalen Institute in 1985 to define spiritual emergency and how to help manage persons having this crisis. Dr. Stan Groff and Christina Groff, the 2 co-founders of the Spiritual Emergence Network, celebrated Emma Bragdon's service, which included when Emma published her first groundbreaking book on the topic, which is called The Source Book for Helping People in Spiritual Emergency. And this was followed by another book she published, The Call of Spiritual Emergency. Both of these books are classics in the field, and it is this groundbreaking work for which we have honored Dr. Emma Bragdon in the Spiritual Awakenings International Circle of Honor. She is currently the founder and executive director of IMHU, Integrative Mental Health for You. This online platform offers courses about the full range of effective options to improve mental health without over-relying on psychiatric medications. 34 courses, mostly online, are taught by Dr. Bragdon and other healthcare providers. Dr. Emma Bragdon teaches a unique training to become a spiritual emergence coach. The IMHU website has an international directory of those who have been certified as spiritual emergence coaches. These coaches offer support to those who are around the world who are integrating spiritually transformative experiences. Now, relating to today's presentation, from 2001 to 2012, Dr. Bragdon studied 6 months of each year in Brazil, learning about Spiritism and guiding 60 groups interested in getting spiritual healing from famous healers in Brazil. During that time, she also published 3 books and co-produced 2 documentary films about Spiritism. She was particularly impressed with how Spiritists can recognize and help people in psychospiritual crisis, also known as spiritual emergency. Dr. Emma Bragdon has also been honored to be named the International Ambassador of one of the largest Spiritist psychiatric hospitals in Brazil. This honor allows her to lead a seminar once a year for healthcare providers to learn from Spiritist psychiatrists, psychologists, and healers in Brazil about their effective therapies. So if we could all take a moment and give Emma Bragdon now a great big round of applause to congratulate her on her induction into the Spiritual Awakenings International Circle of Honor. Congratulations, Emma.
Thank you.
And now I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Emma Bragdon, who is going to be doing her presentation, which springs from her experience and knowledge of Spiritist therapies. Emma.
Thank you so much, Yvonne. Very much appreciate it. And I knew you would be honoring me and inducting me into the Circle of Honor. And I just wanted to say it's wonderful to have that come from you, who's also been a leader in this field. And also just to have some area where people like us are recognized, because, you know, some circles would say that we're on the lunatic fringe. And so to recognize that this field that we represent and have written about is moving into an area where people are being honored, but also the information is really being taken seriously. It's a wonderful step. And I just want to say thank you so much to your organization for stepping forward into leadership in this zone. It's
Mhm.
wonderful to be part of it. And I'm happy to be here today with you. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Emma.
I also want to just say thank you to all of you who are here today, and also those who are listening to the recording. All of you are seeding also this information around the world, and I appreciate your interest in it and also your willingness to tell others about it. And in terms of accepting being in the circle of honor, I do that on behalf of the incredible teachers that I've had throughout my life. I've been honored to be part of their following, but also just consider that the stars were in the right place so that I could have access to such incredible teachers. So now what I'd like to do is share some slides with you, which will hopefully make it easier for all of us to follow along with in sequence. So forgive me, I'm just going to do a little housekeeping here. Take you on a little trip to South Africa to the elephants first. Okay, so the topic is spiritual emergency and spiritism, and I just found this wonderful photograph. And the reason I think it speaks to me so much is because when people are moving forward in their spiritual awakening, they are really dealing with extremely powerful forces. And it really can help us tremendously if we have some skills and we have some teachers to help us to stay balanced as we are moving through these, getting acquainted with these incredible energies, and possibly even being able to be surfers, as it were, staying erect and staying balanced as we continue to move forward and enjoy the spiritual awakening process. So what I'm going to be covering today is my own story about how I found Spiritism, and a quick definition of spiritual emergency. For those of you who don't recognize that term, I'll be calling it SEY. And I'll go over Spiritism in a nutshell. That's not, by the way, a misspelling of spiritualism. Spiritism is its own thing, as you can think of it as adjacent to spiritualism and very much similar. And then how spiritists themselves recognize spiritual emergency, how spiritists treat someone in spiritual emergency, and then some reflection on if we can actually incorporate some of the therapies that are used by spiritists in Brazil. And that's speaking to all of us who live outside Brazil. And then I will offer some resources for further exploration, and then we'll move into a question and answer period, which I think is about 20 minutes or so. Okay. So my own story goes back to the spring of 2001, and I was invited to teach a 1-week course close to Brasilia, Brazil, which is in the center of Brazil, and you may know it's the capital of Brazil. So this had nothing to do with Spiritism. I didn't even know the word Spiritism at the time, but I was going to be a trainer, training other people to teach this particular 1-week course. So I went through that, and it was all about helping people to basically surf those big waves. In other words, move safely in their own awakening. And a friend of mine, I'll call him Jim, who is paraplegic, said, while you're down there, Emma, would you please go and visit John of God? Because he's a very famous healer, and he could possibly help me walk again. And I just want you to check him out. So I decided to go, and several of my friends also met me there. And when I went to actually interface with John of God, that means meet him directly, which one does in a line that is quite long, because on some days there are 1,000 people who would line up to visit him. When I met him, the energetic experience I had was extremely strong. And then, so I went outside after the meeting and sat down quietly in the garden. And then several mediums came up to me. So this means people who are especially psychic and were very attuned to uh, the passage of people coming through and kind of reading some information about them. And these mediums, who none of whom I'd ever seen before, all said to me one by one, "You're here because you're going to bring spiritism to the rest of the world." And I thought, what is this? They must mistake me for somebody else, because I didn't even know the word spiritism, as I said. Well, anyway, starting that night, there were, let's call that synchronicity, events that happened where I would literally meet people, or they'd be introduced to me, and they were leaders in spiritism in Brazil, and they would invite me to come and visit them. Julica Kiskos had just coordinated a major international conference on transpersonal psychology in Sao Paulo, and she invited me to visit her and meet the leaders that she knew in spiritism. So as I became more acquainted with spiritism, I recognized that John of God, who is still world famous, is not a spiritist, even though some people think he is. But in the process of getting to know John of God and seeing the successes that were going on in terms of people being healed at his center, I did write the book Spiritual Alliances, Discovering the Roots of Health at the Casa Dominacio. I learned a tremendous amount there about spiritual healing, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity. But as I studied Spiritism more, and there are books about it, I thought to myself, was I asleep in graduate school? Why didn't I know about Spiritism before this? I don't understand. And then when I got back home from my first trip, I started looking into books in my bookshelves. What about Houston Smith, who's known as being just brilliant in terms of the whole history of religion? I didn't see any mention of Spiritism. What about William James? Yes, he came from the early 20th century. Did he mention it because Spiritism was alive then? No, he didn't mention it. What about Jung? Did he mention it because he ventured into realms that Spiritism covers? No, I didn't see any mention. So very curious to me. While I was there at the center, I became inspired really to create books. And so as Yvonne had mentioned, I did write 2 books on spiritual emergency, excuse me. And the one up on the upper left used to be called A Source Book for Helping People in Spiritual Emergency. It became renamed because spiritual problems is now being used as a way of identifying when someone is having a spiritual issue in the more conventional world of mental health practitioners. So spiritual problems is used in that arena, but now spiritual emergency is becoming more well known. And so the second book I wrote is The Call of Spiritual Emergency. No name change. Both books still available through Amazon.com. I won't go into the other 2 books on the left-hand side. Well, I'll mention the one on the bottom of the left, the newest DSM, is really a satire on the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, but is also very informative about what that book is about. So on the right-hand side, you'll see Kardec's Spiritism, and that really follows chapter by chapter various Spiritist centers which I visited, and in the back of it there is actually instruction on how to create a Spiritist center. So you recognize I got very deeply into this. And then to the far right and the upper right hand corner, that's actually a documentary film on Spiritism which can be viewed through Gaia.com. And on the bottom right is a book that basically I edited, although I wrote several chapters in it. It's a book that is accessible to anyone because it's written in very plain language. And it also has chapters by Spiritist psychiatrists in Brazil as well as people who are spiritual healers, as well as people who are researchers in the United States, as well as in the UK, who reflect on Spiritism. And the foreword was written by James Lake, a psychiatrist from the United States, who has really been formative in terms of creating this designation of integrative mental health. Okay, so what is this thing called spiritual emergency? Usually most people who are in the field recognize that there are about 12 categories of anomalous experiences in spiritual emergency. And so we have things like psychic opening, for instance, or near-death experience, which can throw people into a spiritual crisis if they don't have some kind of footing with it. And just as an example, a story, Eben Alexander, some of you may have heard of him. He wrote a book called Proof of Heaven. He was a neuroscientist, a neurosurgeon, a tremendous pedigree in terms of universities that he had been educated in and hospitals that he had worked in. And he had a near-death experience which lasted just about a week, very unexpected. But before he had his near-death experience, he was what we could call a materialist. In other words, he didn't really believe in heaven. He didn't have a sense that anyone having what was called already near-death experience could be having any kind of real experience of what lies beyond this particular life on planet Earth. And he basically thought, you know, the visions that people might report after having a near-death experience were probably stress related or some kind of quirk in the brain and just not to be taken seriously. But when he had his own near-death experience, in which he had extremely strong experiences for, at least he was basically out for a week, and then came back and reported this, in other words, remembered a lot of what he experienced, it changed his life radically. And he basically had to take some time out to recover himself, but also to reorient. Like, since he, for instance, since he had experienced all of these very powerful, transformative experiences, he had to reevaluate, what do I want to do with my life? Do I want to continue being a neurosurgeon? Do I want to continue with the kinds of relationships I have? Do I want to change my life and my work life? And so eventually what he did was he has created an organization, as well as a partnership with a woman who does sound therapy. And they lead workshops and give talks, presentations about how people can move into more expanded states of consciousness. And he basically wants to help people have the kind of experience he had in his near death, but without dying first. Thank you, Eben Alexander. So he obviously had a radical change in his own identity, not only his work identity, but his personal identity and his sense of kind of where he fit into life, and life, especially now expanding beyond this life on planet Earth. So he did have good support as he was going through this process, and he really had the best resolution possible for his spiritual emergency. So there are other people, though, who go through a radical change. In other words, they have extremely intense spiritual experiences, and they don't have a good support network to help them, and they don't feel that they can take time out to reevaluate, but they have a very profound disorientation. And if they do approach someone who's been conventionally trained within the mental health system, that person that is there to care for them may kind of look at their checklist for psychosis or serious mental illness and say, wait a minute, this person's experience seems out of this world, therefore it's unreal. So they're out of touch with reality. So that would be a very conventional way of looking at someone who's in an acute stage of a spiritual emergency. So they might check off the list. Okay, that person appears to be psychotic. And then if the person in spiritual emergency is clearly disoriented, and so they're spending less attention on their hygiene or on eating 3 nutritious meals a day or on getting enough sleep, then again, that would be a reason to say perhaps they're mentally ill. And if they tend to be self-absorbed and are having difficulty going to their regular work or doing home chores, again, this would be another thing to check off the list. This person may be seriously mentally ill. So in that situation of a person in spiritual emergency showing up at let's say a clinic or an emergency hospital, or even into a private practice of a practitioner who is conventionally trained, then they may be labeled psychotic, or it may be considered that they need psychiatric medication in order to achieve a sense of balance, especially if that person is agitated or worried, depressed. So frequently in places where we don't have spiritism, we have people who are part of the mental health care system who do not recognize spiritual emergency and are prone to suggest to someone that they may have a mental illness and that they need psychiatric medication. So it can give the client in this situation an identification of, gee, I'm likely mentally ill and maybe I have to take psychiatric medication for the rest of my life. So that's one perspective. And this doesn't happen all the time, that there's a misdiagnosis, as it were, but it can happen, and it's happened too much. So some people have really been, who are in a spiritual awakening process that's very intense, if they become misdiagnosed, and in the cases I talked about, really mistreated, it can be very damaging to them in their life process. So if we go back to the surfer, let's say they've tried to go into a big wave and the big wave is really rolled over them and they've not been able to maintain their balance. I love this cartoon. So this cat is posting that he's lost, and it's identified that he's having a spiritual crisis maybe. So you can, because I'm stressing identification and identity, some people will ask, well, so is a spiritual emergency really an existential crisis? Is it the same? And in some ways, having intense spiritual experiences, so much so that one becomes disoriented for a period of time, can throw a person into an identity crisis. Like think again of Eben Alexander. Who am I really in the big scheme of things, and what do I really most want to do? So that could be similar to an existential crisis. But always in a spiritual emergency, there are very strong spiritual experiences that can lead to transformation. So this is an image that will give you an idea. It can be a very fiery experience, and we associate fire, of course, with transformation. So with adequate support, and Eben Alexander clearly had adequate support, what people will express in terms of the outcome of a spiritual emergency is that they feel better. They have increased well-being. They may have gone through a healing process mentally in terms of expanding their own sense of well-being. They certainly report more peace in their lives. They say that it's much easier to relate to a diverse group of people than ever before. So they have increased their empathy and their compassion for themselves as well as other people. Most people who've been through a spiritual emergency once or maybe more than once have a great desire to be in service to others. They have much less dependency on psychiatric medication. In other words, they have personal resources that they can look to assist them when they go through the ups and downs of life. They express a desire to live from the soul rather than the ego. So that's a profound statement right there. And some people who have gone through spiritual emergency definitely are looking for, how can I live more from the soul than the ego? And what is that transition about? And so they're more apt to look for community where they can achieve that living from the soul. And they might look for a spiritual community, a religious community, or some other kind of community that just resonates to them. And in that process, then they continue to work to have more self-awareness and more creative outlet as well. Many people who've been through a spiritual emergency are drawn to being activists in terms of creating a more sustainable life on planet Earth and preserving nature. And many will report that the process of the spiritual emergency actually enhanced some inner sense that they had of their own healing abilities, possibly of their working in energy work, or possibly being more intuitive than they ever had been before, and possibly even having mental telepathy. Or if they had it before, noticing that it's become enhanced. If a person who has been through a spiritual emergency or is going through it does not have adequate support, there's generally a continuation of fear and self-absorption. So imagine they're disoriented and that disorientation just continues. Because of that disorientation, they might be inclined to isolate themselves away from other people, not talk about their own experience, be more irritable and impatient with others as well as themselves, continue on with not taking good care of themselves. And if it's been suggested to them that they need to have psychiatric medication because they're likely to have a serious mental illness, then they would likely also become more dependent on that psychiatric medication and on that identity. I'm a mentally ill person would be the identification. So those people also who don't have adequate support can become very involved with their inner life on a very private way, in an isolated way, and then become less discerning of what is part of conventional reality. So it becomes more difficult for them to operate within conventional reality, whether it's going to stores and shopping or going to school, having a job, etc. And ultimately, it's these people who may become a danger to themselves or others because this is not a good life that I'm describing right here. So we see the difference between outcomes when someone is well supported and someone is not well supported. And hopefully you've also given it a nod that, boy, we need more people who do get adequate support because the positive outcome is so good. And those people are likely to contribute to life on Earth being more positive, not only for people, but also for animals and the planet itself. So what do we need in order to move into that zone where we're more likely to have more positive outcomes? I would say discernment is the key word. And the discernment that's needed is how do we recognize a true spiritual emergency, not only in ourselves, so that we can, recognize, hey, there's the big wave and it's time to ride it. But also, how do we really manage it over time? Because we don't know how long a spiritual emergency will last. And what do we need to do as we're going through it? Or what do we need to do in order to help someone who may be going through it? So let's recognize that most healthcare providers who may be interfacing with someone who's in a spiritual emergency are the first ones we would look to who need discernment. And unfortunately, they're not taught how to recognize or treat spiritual emergency in their conventional education and also in their skill building. So the other thing that can happen is a real polarizing. In other words, people might get a sense of what spiritual emergency is. They might read an article or interface with someone who claims they're going through a spiritual awakening process. And they might say, well, on the one hand, some people might take the position, gee, all life is spiritual awakening. And so mental disturbance does not exist. I've heard some people say that, who are very much in the camp and on the far end of the spectrum of everything is spiritual. And on the other end of the spectrum, with people who are very attached to the biomedical model of illness and mental health, they might say, well, wait a minute, any kind of thing that's reported as a spiritual experience could really be a delusion. In fact, likely is. So Eben Alexander himself thought before his near-death experience that what people were experiencing when they reported to him they'd had a near-death experience was delusion, and could be written off as just part of the difficulty of being in the hospital or almost dying. But still, delusion is delusion. It's not putting any value on it. The other part of looking at discernment is that people having the life experience also need discernment. So I run into some people who would much prefer to say that they have no psychological issues to work on at all because they're having a spiritual experience. And so some people will want to actually avoid working with personal issues and instead just identify themselves completely with their spiritual experiences. So we're in a zone now, and I would love to hear what all of you think about this, but my sense is we're in a zone where people are still quite confused about what is spiritual emergency, and is it real, and how should we even be thinking about it, and how can we train others to be thinking about it and be really help managing spiritual emergency within themselves, and also to benefit others. My own experience with this, and I do train spiritual emergence coaches, as Yvonne noted, is that frequently when people are having these acute spiritual emergency situations, that psychological material does show up, and it's basically making a strong claim that the person needs to confront some psychological issues they've never confronted before and work through them as part of the process of spiritual growth and opening to higher realms of consciousness. So there can be an interpenetration between spiritual and psychological. So the problem for all of us, not just the homeless ones on the street, but for all of us, is that we can't easily tell the difference between a deeply wise, intuitive nudge from the universe and one of our own boneheaded ideas. So I'm one of the first ones to lay claim to that one. And so discernment actually can assist us to move into the direction where we do recognize the difference and can thus be more well-guided in terms of making decisions for our own life, but also in recognizing what's going on with another person and how can we best help them. Now, moving closer into Spiritism, I would say that when I look at overall at what Spiritism and Spiritists who identify with Spiritism, their real brilliance in this field is that they have discernment, a tremendous amount of discernment to recognize people who are in this particular process of having spiritually transformative experiences and shifting in their identity and needing the right kind of support. The other thing that they offer is a profound understanding of how energy moves in the system and how applying healing energy can be extremely helpful for assisting someone to stay in balance as they're going through these transformative experiences. And another key, which probably should not be the third on the list at all, is exhibiting a nurturing and loving compassion, which is tremendously helpful to anyone who's going through the process of a spiritual awakening. Okay, so we come to Spiritism, and this was me in 2001. What is it, and why haven't I heard about it? So the triangle is a symbol that is associated with Spiritism. And consider that there are 3 points on this triangle. One represents philosophy, the other represents science, and the other point represents ethics. In other words, having a moral way of life. So Spiritism is not a religion, according to Allan Kardec, who wrote the 5 foundational books about it. The books were written in the 1860s, and Allan Kardec himself came upon spiritualists in the 1850s because it was kind of like the thing to do, you know, go to a seance, tip some tables and see if we can connect with the spirits and see what they might have to say to us. So he went to one of these meetings, and then actually within the first meeting, someone who was gifted as a channeler channeled some information from a higher being that identified that Kardec would have some extremely important role to play in bringing out some of the knowledge that the spirits have to help human beings. Well, he was an academic and an extremely organized and serious man. And at first he was completely bowled over by this idea. And then he started saying, well, you know, so many people are into it, this is worth exploring. And then what happened was 5 books came out of him. So the books are still available. They're readily accessible on Amazon. And what you find as you drill down into it is that he decided that Spiritism was going to be different than spiritualism, because many spiritualists were oriented towards the phenomenon of connecting with spirits. Wow, look what we can do with a Ouija board. You know, someone might want to connect with us. How cool. So at that time, so we're talking about the 1850s and 60s, spiritualism was very oriented towards the phenomena. But as Kardec listened to many mediums and interviewed them and collated then what information came through them that was similar. So it wasn't just one medium who gave an answer to one of his questions, but several mediums who gave the same answer to one question. So he collated that together. And what he came up with is the reason for life is spiritual evolution. And Spiritism then is completely oriented to supporting each other's spiritual evolution, which is a very different path than just getting focused on the phenomena of speaking to spirits or thinking that they might exist. Now, again, through the spirits, what came is that karma is a principle that is alive and well in the universe we live in. And we need to recognize that whenever we do some particular kind of act that is not motivated by compassion or love, that it will set something in motion so that at a later time, we will understand we were not acting out of compassion or love. That doesn't mean we're going to be punished, but we'll be given the opportunity to move into more balance. Another thing that came from the spirits is that we not only move into the spiritual realm after this life, but reincarnation happens. Good bumper sticker. Reincarnation happens, which means that we not only move into the spirit realm after being in this particular life, but that after being in the spirit realm, we will have the opportunity, most likely, to come back into a life. And so there is continual learning, again, always oriented towards spiritual evolution. In other words, becoming more compassionate and more wise. The other thing that is recognized within Spiritism is that some people are highly sensitive and gifted as mediums. Now, they may not come out of the chute and be born with exactly the knowledge of how to work with that gift, but some people are extremely gifted, and the orientation for mediums needs to be that they harness their gifts in order to help other people. And the model that the Spiritists take on is Christ. So that doesn't mean that they're only open to Christians or that they're trying to remodel everyone into Christians, but and actually their doors are open to people of all religious faiths, and they are basically suggesting a philosophy of life. But to go back to the triangle, it's think of it as a philosophy that's being offered. And Kardec himself said, if science comes up with anything that proves our philosophy wrong, then science will trump that philosophy. So science was a core point, I'll just leave it at that, within Spiritism. And also the recognition was there that unless a person follows very strong ethics, and we can think of the 10 Commandments, which are echoed in almost every single religion and spiritual group in some form or another. But ethics are extremely important if one really wants to evolve spiritually. So some people especially in Brazil will say, wait a minute, Spiritism is a religion, and it's the path of life, the practical path of life of Christianity, which includes reincarnation and karma and talking to spirits, which is not usually part of Christianity. But anyway, some people will claim it is a religion. But Kardec himself, if you go back to the foundational books, will say, nope, not a religion, philosophy. All right, but we do have at the base that there are disembodied spirits who are in communication with embodied people. And that can be extremely good. In other words, human beings who are mediums can access disembodied spirits who are of very high evolution and intelligence, and bring that intelligence to people who are embodied. So that can be great. But Kardec said very clearly what he got from the mediums is that there are some spirits who are not so good. In other words, they either want to play with people, they want to tease them, they want to put patterns of thinking into their mind that are extremely negative and could be even lead to self-destruction. So it's extremely important, if anyone is going to move into the world of communicating with spirits, that they do so with intention only to communicate with those disembodied beings that are of positive intention. So how popular is this? When I was counting and writing books, so that wasn't very long ago, there were about 13,000 Spiritist community centers in Brazil. And again, they were there to support spiritual evolution. These community centers may be sometimes adjacent to a psychiatric hospital, but they're not the same as a psychiatric hospital. So they're all ecumenical in welcoming people from all religions, all cultures, all sexual orientations. They provide classes, study groups for all ages. They also do organized volunteering. For instance, they might have a soup kitchen or something of that kind that benefits the community. And they also train mediums and healers. So like Alcoholics Anonymous, they allow for total anonymity. They don't look to create members that would then all be on public display. So anonymity is basically guaranteed if one wants it. And everything in the Spiritist Center is for free. So that's an extraordinary thing that they're making available. Now, also in Brazil, there are 50 Spiritist psychiatric hospitals. So again, they're independent of the community centers, but in some cases, there may be a community center which is on the same grounds as a psychiatric hospital, but independent. And they offer the very best of conventional psychiatric care, just what you'd find here in the United States or outside of Brazil and other countries. But they, in addition to the conventional therapies, they also offer Spiritist therapies. And the people who do the Spiritist therapies are either mediums or they're trained, who are highly trained, or there are healers who are also very highly trained. And these people collaborate with the psychiatrists. So they're not off in some little corner of the psychiatric hospital on a wing where they're considered kind of out there and not to be brought in for the real work that's happening, but instead there's a real collaboration. And within the Spiritist psychiatric hospitals, the larger ones, they offer both residential care as well as outpatient care. So I like to think of the community centers kind of like our convenience stores. Why? Because there are so many of these community centers. They basically serve a fifth of the population of Brazil. That's 20 to 40 million people will go to a Spiritist community center when they want to really address the spiritual side of the healing that they're looking for, either because of a mental health issue or a physical issue or both. And they, even though they don't use the term spiritual emergency, they have been working with this framework for over 100 years. So they have 100 years of experience to share with us. Imagine that if you go into a hospital and you're going, a psychiatric hospital in this case, and you're going to be assessed right away, you might meet with a doctor or someone like a physician who checks out to see if you have any physical issues going on. You might meet with a social worker to see if there are any kind of social issues, for instance, poverty, prejudice, etc., that may be directly impacting you. And you might meet with, in Brazil, in a Spiritist psychiatric hospital, a medium who is a medical intuitive, we could say, in our English language, and they can recognize what is often translated in the Brazilian works as repressed mediumicity. That's such an awkward term. I prefer to use repressed sensitivity. So think of it as like a diamond in the rough, which might look an awful lot like coal. In other words, someone who's really in a state of darkness. Or it could actually represent someone who is in a process of transformation from, let's say, coal into diamond, and they have a lot of sensitivities. And if they're given the appropriate training, they can harness those sensitivities and become a very strong medium. So again, when someone is being assessed, when they're in the Spiritist psychiatric hospital just coming in, a medical intuitive would be able to tell if they have this repressed sensitivity. And then they would be put into a situation where they can get not only some knowledge, so they have some kind of a cognitive framework for understanding what is being told to them, but also so that they can meet with other people who might also have these sensitivities, and then become educated and get some training about how to harness them. So that in itself can move someone from thinking that they are mentally ill to recognizing that they have a tremendous gift to give, and that they have other people they can associate with who are like themselves. And so suddenly they have a totally different sense of themselves and a different kind of community to belong with. The medical intuitives can not only identify those with the repressed sensitivities, but they can also recognize if there are negatively motivated spirits that are impacting that person. They can also recognize if positive spirits are impacting them. And this allows them to also recognize what kind of, we call it treatment, but if someone's not really ill, they don't need exactly treatment, but they need some kind of way to manage these very powerful energies that they've moved into. So I'm recognizing I don't have a lot of time and I'm compressing a lot of information into a very short presentation. But I'll just say that when I entered into one of the first real spiritist centers that I was introduced to, the woman who's head of it, who is recognized as one of the most powerful mediums, said, well, you must have needed like 3 taxis to get over here. And I thought she was making a comment about how fat I was. Like, what do you mean? Or, you know, that I had too much luggage. I was just one of those ugly Americans who had too much stuff. And I thought to myself quietly, what is she talking about? She recognized that I had a lot of spirit guides who were with me, who were basically guiding me into understanding more deeply what a spiritist and what spiritist centers were all about. So the graphic here is coal with a diamond in it, which I think is a really good analogy. I wanted to say a little bit about one man that I was able to meet, a Brazilian man by the name of Marcelo. And he had actually did not have significant trauma in his life, but at the age of about 28, he had become depressed and then had moved into something more disturbing. And his parents were wealthy enough to take him to one of the best psychiatrists in Sao Paulo. And they thought of him as being schizophrenic. He was taken to a psychiatric hospital, put on antipsychotics. And unfortunately, he was really going on a downward spiral. So when I saw him, he had actually just been into a spiritist psychiatric hospital where he had learned, he'd been through the full assessment, and he had learned that he was, in fact, a very powerful healer and medium in the rough that needed training. Now, one of Marcelo's thoughts was, wait a minute, I'm a Catholic, spiritists are kind of weird, we shouldn't go there. And I'm hearing voices, so that means I'm absolutely nuts. That was his idea, but he transformed into not only coming into the hospital with those negative impressions about his own identity, but he had moved into a place where he had gotten the training and done some of the study and received energy work also that had helped him to stay more balanced in his own energy system. And he was now living outside the hospital, taking training to become better as a healer, and then going back into the hospital to work with some of the patients in the hospital. So he had completely shifted his role. And of course, you can imagine how uplifting it was, not only for him and his family, but also for the other people in the psychiatric hospital to see his transformation. So if we're looking at how do spiritists treat someone like Marcelo, they would not be over relying on psych meds, but they might give someone psych meds for a period of time if, for instance, they can't sleep well. So it's not that psych meds are thought as the never use them, but more it's something to use just cautiously. There is energy work that's available. Marcelo, as an inpatient, had it twice a week. And he was also offered blessed water. So this is water that has actually been given energy work so that it then becomes something that can be like a healing component. He also participated in prayer and fellowship in the hospital, but especially in the community centers. Prayer and fellowship is extremely important. And energy work and blessed water are also offered in the community centers. I mentioned compassionate understanding earlier, and again, that is considered essential in the treatment, especially of anyone in the hospital, but also within the community centers. So when I take people to go and learn more about Spiritism, they always speak to me about how loving everyone is in the Spiritist Center and how they were approached with what some of us are haven't had for like 10 months, which is the hugs. So there's lots of hugging and connecting going on within the Spiritist centers. And of course, in the Spiritist Psychiatric Hospital, there's a situation where the practitioners, especially of the energy work, have to be very careful about touch so that it isn't misinterpreted. And the energy work can be done without any touch. So Marcelo was also had to recognize, as someone in the hospital who was going through the transformation, that he had to really not only change his mind about Spiritists, but study and learn from others and listen to others about this whole realm of being a healer and what Spiritist mediums also were able to do. In the Spiritist hospitals and the community centers, there can be a lot of different therapies that are used. So it's not just the conventional therapies that we have here. And in addition, the Spiritist therapies, which I'll go into in a little bit more depth in a few minutes. But in some of them, they also offer like Bert Hellinger's family systems therapy, which is an extraordinary kind of therapy that's evolved in the last 50 years. They also may offer various kinds of herbal treatments. So they're open to what essentially works. And it's been fascinating for me to see the kinds of combinations of therapies that are offered. And again, remember that in the community centers, all of this is offered for free. In the Spiritist hospitals, they can actually offer the therapy at a very low cost to those people who are financially troubled, but it's certainly well below anything that we have in the United States in terms of the amount of money that's asked for. Now, if someone doesn't respond to the kinds of therapies that I've just listed above, then within the community centers, as well as in the hospitals, the patient may be able to get what's called disobsession, which is that the very well-trained mediums are meet independent of the patient. In other words, they're separate, they're in a totally different room. The patient has had to authorize that disobsession can be done, but they're not only not present, but they don't even know when it's happening. And the goal of the disobsession is to assist the patient so that they no longer are being impacted by a negatively motivated spirit, but also assist that spirit to move on in their own spiritual evolution. So both are being healed. Okay, so I've mentioned then that someone in spiritual emergency may be a medium in the rough. I'm not knowing how much longer. I mean, I have an hour to do this presentation, but I think I'm going to be running over a little time. Is that okay, Yvonne and Linda? Okay.
Yeah, yes, it's okay, Anna. Go right ahead.
Thank you. So in the energy passes, this is just a graphic depiction. Imagine that the people who are seated are receiving the energy work. The people who are in colorful clothing are the ones who are giving the energy work. And the beings that are behind them who have their either one or both hands raised are actually spirits. consider that there are some spirits who actually volunteer and say, okay, I will help in the human realm with healing that is going on. And then they make themselves accessible either in the Spiritist hospitals or the Spiritist community centers to help with the energy work. So that the idea then is that if the practitioner is going to do a healing, he or she will first ask for help, and that the energy will come through them and then be delivered to the person who is receiving the help. And that energy can come directly from the highest realms, let's say God or the angelic realms or benevolent spirits, or the spirits that have been basically assigned to that center to help. And then it goes through the practitioner, so oftentimes without that practitioner using any of their own bioenergy, and then directly into the patient, who is then helped by this infusion of energy, which disperses complexes or difficulties that are happening in their that can be perceived by the medium in the energy field. But in some cases also the person receiving help can get healing for physical issues as well. And these sessions may last only 5 minutes, but they're done quite frequently. When I first went to a Spiritist center, they actually did an energy pass. This is a direct translation from the Brazilian Portuguese. They did an energy pass on me right after I took my coat off, just before I entered in. So they're done quite frequently. I mentioned blessed water is one of the therapies. And if you're acquainted with Emoto's work, it has been put in books, but it's also accessible through YouTube, and you can just Google it. But you can see some very dramatic photographs that show molecules of water that have either had a label put on a glass of water, let's say, and let's say the label was love. And so the intention was to infuse that water with a loving vibration. But in some other cases, the water has just been impacted by someone sending, as it were, or the intention that that water would be changed into the kind of water that would be healing for a particular person. So this technique of infusing water with a healing vibration is used in the Spiritist centers, and people bring bottles of water to the centers when they come to visit that can then be infused with good vibrations and can be taken home and then used as part of the therapy. I mentioned something already about the disobsession meetings, but I just wanted to let you know, especially in today's world where so many people are using religious rituals, sometimes drugs, and sometimes very intense ceremony to shift into altered states of consciousness. In a disobsession meeting, it happens in a room that is basically bare of candles and religious symbols. There's no incense, there's certainly no drugs, and they might have a boom box that plays like classical or relaxing new agey kind of music, so that the mediums coming in can separate themselves from that brain wavelength that they use when you drive safely, and then move into more the zone of being in service to help with getting information from the spirits about the patient that can then benefit the patient in terms of understanding more what's happening with them, and also how their healing process can best be managed for the best outcome. Can we import this? Well, we can say, yes, there's more awareness about spiritual emergency now. There's more acceptance of anomalous experiences. There's more understanding of consciousness. And the materialistic reductionist approach within medicine and mental health is losing hold. In some corners, spirit release and soul retrieval therapies are gaining acceptance. But if we really want to import the Spiritist way, we have to recognize, well, wait a minute, Spiritist mediums never charge a fee. How would that work in our communities or with our individuals who want to do this? And Spiritist mediums only work in supervised groups, and they train for decades. Would that work for us? Because there's some people who just say, wait a minute, I'm a medium and I'm going to go out on my own now. So that's maybe not part of the Spiritist way that some people prefer to do. And I just want to say that after spending a good deal of time at John of God Center, the healing, and recognizing what a tremendously powerful man he was in terms of assisting people in their healing, he did not have a supervisor. He had no one to go to who he could speak to and get feedback about how he was doing. And he ran into huge problems. And one of the problems was actually, and this happened a little over a year ago, is that it was recognized that he had sexually abused over 600 women and who reported him. So I'm not saying that that would happen to every medium who goes out on their own, but that holding the position of being a powerful medium or healer is an extremely difficult job. And we need, I think, to have a group of people we can talk to, as well as someone who can be in that role of supervisor for us. Now, a fortunate thing is there's more international interest in this. This is one of the groups on our R&R Day. And so it's been very fun for me to be meeting with more people who are interested in this realm. This is a list of resources, and I'm not quite sure how we can get this to people because it's just a slide now. And I'd love to be able to make this available to people. Maybe we can work something out through Spiritual Awakenings International where it becomes available. And just to say that, yes, usually every year without the pandemic, I am leading a 7-day seminar in Brazil. And there is information about that on the imhu.org site. If you go just to imhu.org and go to the catalog of what we offer, you will see the Brazil seminar offered there. I also offer through IMHU a course for people who are going through a spiritual emergence process, who want to learn more about it, have a framework for it, and learn more about how to manage it to have the best outcome. So that's good, not only for people who are going through the experience, but also for healthcare providers who want to learn more about how to assist someone and support someone in spiritual emergency. So that's available, as well as training for spiritual emergence coaches who are in the best possible position to help someone who's in spiritual emergency. And then there's a 3-week training that I've recently put together, especially for yoga instructors and body workers, so that they also can learn better how to manage spiritually transformative experiences in themselves, but also with the people who come to them. So I'm not too much over time, just a couple minutes, but I just want to thank you all so much for listening. And it's quite an extraordinary audience when I'm not seeing the chat at all. So I hope I haven't gone too fast for you. I do have a private practice, so I'm available for personal consultation at emmabragdon.com. You can read more about it. And again, if you want to go into IMHU, and we do offer 34 seminars and courses, and that's readily available on our site, imhu.org. And my personal contact information is there. So at this point, I'll stop share, and I guess we're going to do Q&A, huh, Linda?
That's it. We got some lined up for you.
Do we? Okay.
All right. Before I get into those, I just want to say that image you had of the spirits going through the practitioner to the client, it was a great rendition. It just emphasized the power comes from the other source, not necessarily the practitioner themselves.
Oh, Good. That
I
speaks
thought
to you,
that
huh?
was a good one.
Okay.
All right, so the first question that was on there was the name of that Gaia production, and you have that on your resource slide. And I sent a note to everybody that that resource slide will be in the recording. And if you consider it as a separate attachment, we could also share it that way.
Yes, I'm happy to give that to Spiritual Awakenings International, that, and I don't know how you would post it, but maybe post it along with the recording itself for people who'd like to read more or see videos, etc.
Okay. So there was a question from Irina asking about training the healers and mediums. What language is that training done? Is it in Portuguese? What are the names of these centers
Uh-huh.
in the Portuguese language?
I'm thinking that might be the arena I know from Russia. But so the if we're talking about Brazilian Spiritist centers, almost all of the training is done in Portuguese. So it is Brazil, that's their native language. But there are also numerous people who live in Brazil who speak Spanish. And so in Brazil, you also may be able to access that training that is done in Spanish. One thing I haven't mentioned yet is that Spiritism is actually international. So there is an international group. You can Google it online, and you will find that there are about 70 Spiritist centers in the United States. You cannot
Okay.
make the assumption that you can get training at any of those centers because as I tried to emphasize, the training for mediums and healers can take decades. And of course, you have a supervisor in the Spiritist centers in Brazil. And so it's a quite sophisticated aspect of what they offer. And in the United States, we simply don't have those kinds of sophisticated mediums who can offer that kind of training. So there are a couple of them that I know about in the United States, but they come few and far between, especially if they're going to work in English. So again, most of them are working with people who speak Spanish or Portuguese.
Okay. Next question's from Yvonne. What is the success rate of Spiritist psychiatric treatment? Are the psychological issues looked at to avoid spiritual bypass?
Great question, Yvonne. Thank you. So because I was not meeting our our time frame, I skipped over going through the resources. And one of the resources I wanted to highlight is that in the book, Spiritism and Mental Health, I go over in more depth exactly what kind of research has been published about the success of the Spiritist therapies, especially in the psychiatric hospitals. Unfortunately, for those of us, especially who are trained in the United States and Canada and Europe, and I probably should include other countries too, but I'm not familiar with them. We take it as extremely important to do research and to publish in peer-reviewed journals in order to really validate if something true is going on. And I was trained in that way. You were likely trained in that way. And so when I first showed up at these Spiritist centers, I was asking right away, oh, where's the research? I'd love to read about this. And my Portuguese was good enough, you know, that I was ready to do that. But I kept being told, well, not really, there isn't much. So I did meet a psychiatrist, Dr. Yvonne Hervé, who was in Porto Alegre, and I reprinted his research in Spiritism and Mental Health. And he did a 20-year study in a community center in Brazil, and where he recognized that most of those people were only doing Spiritist therapies and did not take any kind of psychiatric medication. And there were some astounding results, including for kids who were who had very severe illness bordering on real cognitive impediments, put it that way. So there is quite a bit that can be gleaned from the research that he's done, and also the research from another man who's worked in a residence for people who were extremely intellectually challenged. In other words, their parents could no longer care for them. And so they were put into a spiritist residence for people like themselves outside of Sao Paulo. I visited this place. And the psychiatrist who was the head of this particular hospital did some research in terms of looking at the improvements that people made, not only in their sense of being able to be at peace with themselves, but also their growing in compassion for others and empathy for others, and their sense of really deeper peace within themselves. And he's written in very medically oriented language, and it's been published. But outside of that, and his name is Dr. Leao, Frederick Leao. So outside of that, there have been numerous psychiatrists who have written recently describing what spiritist therapies are about and what they attempt to do, and comparing them to conventional work. But it still has not really come about that we have a huge body of research. And what I like to think about is that if a researcher and someone who is in real trouble, in other words, feeling emotionally unbalanced, came to the door of a spiritist, and they both knocked on the door at the same time, the spiritist would look at the researcher and say hello and be nice to them, but they would absolutely attend to the person in trouble first. And in that way, it's really a display of the amount of loving attention that they have. And research is pretty far down the list in terms of the priorities. Does that answer your question?
Well, we're gonna hope so, because that was
Okay.
quite a bit to share.
Okay.
So I'm looking, we got 10 more messages, and I just want to say that there's a lot of statements of affirmation. I'll share this chat with you later on. We found out how to save these. But there's a comment here from Andrea that's an affirmation. It says, "Thank you so much. I am from Colombia and had struggled with mediumistic issues almost for life. 5 years ago, I found a place like the ones you're mentioning in Colombia, and I have to say they have changed my life."
Mhm.
That's just sharing an affirmation. Somebody took your course and said they highly recommend it. And there's one here in a different language from Leslie. It says, "Muito obrigada." It was wonderful. I hope I
Basically,
didn't butcher that.
that's a thanks a lot in Portuguese.
Okay. Again, from Andrea, I received the mediumistic training, but if this topic is hard in South America, here in the States, it is a bit harder. So you talked about some of the centers in Brazil and in America, that there's definitely some differences, is what I heard you say. Great information, nicely done. Could you please comment? This is from Jelena Fu. Could you please comment on Kundalini experiences versus spiritual emergencies?
That could be a huge topic, as in let's spend the weekend on it. So how to be relatively brief about this. I'm actually part of the Self-Realization Fellowship, and what is offered within that fellowship is the wisdom of Yogananda. And even though they don't promote or advertise, hey, come on over and we'll help you raise your Kundalini, the meditations actually do exactly that. They raise awareness, and for those of us who are interested in energy, we can relate that very strongly to Kundalini. So some people who go through a spiritual emergence or spiritual awakening process have very strong Kundalini or energetic experiences as their consciousness becomes more expanded, and some people don't. And I'm working with 2 clients right now who've had extremely strong Kundalini experiences, and it has brought their energy to the point where they have become quite imbalanced because there are some psychological issues that they know they have to work with in order to integrate the expanded consciousness. So there can be a huge relationship between spiritual emergence and Kundalini, but it doesn't always happen. How's that, Linda? I'm trying to be briefer.
Well, I think showing there's other resources and that topic takes more time, it might be something for a future dialogue.
Isn't Yvonne going to be speaking about that actually next month? Yes, Robert
Yes.
nodding his head. Okay. There you go. Fabulous
I'm going to be talking about Kundalini and near-death experiences, and minimally about spiritual emergency. But Dr. Bonnie Greenwell is going to be speaking in March, and she's going to be speaking about Kundalini awakening in a lot more detail.
Thank you.
Okay. This is from Andrea again. I would love to hear more from the integrality between this type of view, the Espiritismo and current transpersonal psychology development. Does
So
that term ring a bell?
that's yeah, Espiritismo is really a way of saying spiritism. So looking at spiritism, the relationship between spiritism and transpersonal psychology is what I got.
Yes.
Whoa, that's a huge, huge topic again, but it's a wonderful topic. I love thinking about it and talking to people about it. And I just to try to be brief, let's say that spiritism is very, very clearly oriented to the dialogue that Allan Kardec had with spirits, and then the foundational materials that were created out of that channeling. So spiritism could be considered as extremely interesting information for anyone interested in transpersonal psychology. And certainly there's a lot of resonance, but transpersonal psychology is also interested in a lot more than only spiritism. Spiritism would be a phenomena in the world and a group in the world that would fit under transpersonal psychology, but it's definitely not the same thing.
Okay. I do have a question here from Jan. She says, you were mentioning the coaches. You were in a dialogue about the coaches. Are you referring to the spiritualists themselves, or are there spiritual emergency coaches also?
So within spiritism, they really consider that fellowship, called fraternidade in Portuguese, is extremely important. And so in a way, everyone who participates over time in a spiritist center learns more about assisting other people, supporting spiritual awakening. But that is not formalized. So it's not certified. People don't go through training for it. It's just considered part of being in the community. But the organization that I founded and represent, Integrative Mental Health for You, is operating basically outside of the spiritist paradigm, even though we teach about it. And I offered training for people who want to be a spiritual emergence coach. And we certainly take some of what spiritism has to offer, but it's not all spiritist. It really comes more from a transpersonal psychology model.
Okay, thank you. This is from Marina. She would like to know, how are the centers in Brazil funded?
By donation. And totally extraordinary for me. And when I heard that at first, I thought, gee, what I was taught was Brazil is a poor country. But when I went to the Center for Brazilian Spiritism, in other words, their central office in Brasilia, it was made of marble. It was extraordinary. It was beautiful, which led me to believe that the people who are Spiritists in Brazil consider it to be extremely important. And so they're willing to give to it. And yes, there are also wealthy families who give to it. And I'm sure some of the wealthier families have been in a position to not only donate, but also in some times to create centers and purchase office buildings in the location where they live.
Okay. Marilyn shared the name of somebody that trained them in the States, but I'm going to pass that over. Without further comment, Carol Ring would like, she gives a great testimony how Brazil seems to be years ahead of us in the US. But there are effective coaches in the United States also. I'm trying to get to the 16 new questions that are coming up. Lori wants to share, is it possible that a diagnosis of bipolar with psychosis is just that without having a spiritual component?
Yes, it is possible. So the man who created the first Soteria House, a psychiatrist who was funded mainly by the National Institutes of Mental Health, wrote a book called Soteria. And the house was actually an idea he had to bring people who were seriously mentally ill, that's the way they were diagnosed in the conventional system, bring them into a residence where they would be given compassionate care by paraprofessionals. And the idea was they would grow out of the serious disturbance that they were in. And it happened to large degree so that people could literally withdraw from their medications and achieve a high level of healing to the extent they could participate more fully in the conventional reality, having relationships, having work, etc. And he writes in the book Soteria that every single person at one point or another talked about having had a mystical experience. So that doesn't mean that everyone who is emotionally disturbed has a spiritual experience, but it did mean that in his experience, those people who were quite young in their first break psychosis, that's what that was the entry card to get into Soteria House to begin with, that each one of them at one point or another had a mystical experience. I find that extremely interesting.
Okay. Deborah just shares with us a comment that she too had a firsthand encounter with John the Baptist and that she could see his energy as a concentric ball.
John of God.
John of God, what did I say?
John the Baptist.
Oh, sorry, John of God, I'm sorry. Leslie states, I am a retired psychotherapist who worked for 50 years in Toronto with clients who had experienced trauma in childhood. While doing this, I was experiencing many spiritual events and incorporated my limited experience with this in my treatment approach. I now have trained as a medium and quickly found that I was comfortable with the mediumship as you describe it, and that she is a Canadian by birth. Thank you. They're from Vermont, VT. Another thank you. That's from Christina. Francis Liu has a question. Are there any centers or clinics in North America using aspects of Spiritism?
Great question, Francis. Francis and I know each other. And I have greatly acknowledge all of his contributions in this field. So, Francis, that's such a great question. And I cannot say that I am aware of any clinic that is using all of what the Spiritist therapies have to offer. I was contacted not very long ago by a woman who was trained at Stanford as a psychiatrist. She did a residency at Stanford. And she said, all I want to do is create a spiritist psychiatric hospital in the United States. Will you help? So since that time, we've had many discussions, and we're looking at how that could be possible and also the difficulties in creating it. And I would love to know of any place in the United States that is a mental health clinic or private practice even that is using the spiritist principles, not only the principles, but actually the treatments themselves, who is really educated in the kinds of treatments that I talked a little bit about today. So sorry to have to say that. I wish there was more.
Hmm. Gotta wonder why. If it works, why isn't there more of it? I've got a nice comment here from Tamara from South Carolina. She's a 6-time near-death experiencer, and she relates some of her experience to what she heard you share today. Jelena Fu also shares an appreciation for your presentation. And there's a book, one of the books Alan Kardec was the person you mentioned from 1860, and Tamara also recommended that his Book of Mediums by Alan Kardec be read by all mediums. So.
That's a difficult place to start, I think. If anyone wants to get into the spiritist materials, that's something to look forward to reading if you're interested in mediumship, but it's very dense material as a starting place. One of the things that I wrote on the resources is there's a man who was a fantastic medium. He has since passed on. He went by the name of Chico Xavier, Xavier, who frequently did not write under that name because he was channeling information. He channeled over 700 books, and he channeled them to the extent that he could write and not need any grammatical change, any kind of spelling change, any kind of anything change. It could go right to the publisher and be published because he was so accurate and in line. And his books are written more as stories. They're narratives that people love to read and are extremely informative in terms of how the interaction between the spirit realm and the human realm works. So there are a number of books that have been authored by him, which are available in English. Chico Xavier.
I'm going to go back to that resource book and get that name again.
Yeah,
your resources.
I'll send that the contents of that slide to you. So
okay, that'd be great. I had a question from Clara. Could a person with a mental condition such as hoarding be helped with this method since it is not a psychosis?
You know, one of the things that impresses me very much about Spiritism is that they deal with each situation uniquely. So they don't make big generalizations like everyone who has hoarding has a spiritual component to it, and thus they should do a spiritist kind of therapy. But it could very well be that people who are experiencing something that is an obsession or a compulsion like hoarding, there is a spiritual component to it. And so it might be worth exploring. I can think of all people who have like addictive responses to life, and think of the work actually of the man who wrote the primary literature for Alcoholics Anonymous. And the idea is that until you have really created a strong personal connection to God or whatever your name is for the highest, that there's energy that goes out to other things in some kind, sometimes in destructive or self-destructive ways. That could be true of people who hoard as well.
Okay. Just a comment from Carol, again, that she was informed that there's a new 6-story building in the Philippines that is dedicated to alternative healing. So that might be a resource to look for.
I'd like to
Another-
say that the Philippines actually have a very strong spiritist connection.
Oh, really? That's interesting.
And there are a lot of spiritist healers in the Philippines. Yes.
Okay. Somebody provided the download for the book that was discussed before. And Francis says Soteria by Lauren Mosher. It's on Amazon. And this is resource books. And there's a current movie on Netflix with Kardic's information. And from Christina, having lived in Brazil, but being born in the US, I think that we are a culture, as a culture, are still so materialistic that it would be hard for us to build a healing center driven by love and trust, not money. But we are trying to do that here through our website, sharing with love and trust that information will be shared correctly. And Jackie just sent us a list of the resources too. Did I get to the end of the list? I think I did. So again, I apologize for not reading everybody's comments of accolades, but Emma, your material was very well received by a lot of people who are actually listening to this presentation.
Thank you.
So I'm getting ready to turn this over, close this. Oh, I got one more. Who's going to get that last question in? Let's see what this is. Sorry. From Lori. Thank you to Francis, Paula, and Tamara for giving some good questions. All right, so I'm going to turn this over to the next person on our agenda.
Robert Baer.
Thank you very much, Dr. Emma Bragdon. It was a great presentation. Thank you. And we want to thank IMHU, Integrative Mental Health for You, for co-sponsoring the event. And just to remind everybody that Spiritual Awakenings International presents online speaker events the third Saturday of each month. And since this came up, February 6th, Dr. Yvonne Cason, our Dr. Yvonne Cason, is going to be speaking at the San Diego Ions on Kundalini and NDEs, and we're going to be co-sponsoring. SAI will be co-sponsoring that presentation. And as a reminder, next month, Dr. Jeffrey Long on February 20th.
Sorry, Robert, we can't hear you. Can you unmute again?
How far did I get?
There we go. You said we want to remind you on February 20th and then you cut out.
February 20th, Dr. Jeffrey Long is going to be doing a presentation on NDE, evidence of the afterlife. And just wanted to let you know that we also have a few future plans for SAI, which include an Espanol presentation, a conference, and our first attempt at the NDE Talking Dead panel, which is something that I'm looking forward to. And I want to thank everybody. We're truly international. I believe we had people here, people on our guest list from Colombia, Canada, Greece, United Kingdom, Serbia, the Czech Republic, Australia, and Portugal. And Dr. Emma Bragdon, you did a wonderful job today. I learned a lot from you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Robert.
And I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Cason for a goodbye.
Thank you, Emma. It was absolutely fabulous. So I just want to invite everyone who's listening, if you've not yet subscribed to Spiritual Awakenings International, please go on the line and subscribe so you'll get announcements, www.spiritualawakeningsinternational.org. And So with that, I'm going to sign off and say goodbye to everybody until February. So goodbye, au revoir, auf Wiedersehen, adios, buenos tardes, arrivederci, Dag, farewell, and ciao. Bye, everybody. See you next time.